All right, strap in, everyone. Today we're going deep on the Battle of the Somme. One of the defining moments of World War One. And you guys have sent us some really interesting sources on this, so we're going to try and go beyond just the dates and the names. We really want to understand why this battle unfolded the way it did, the impact it had on the war, and even how it still shapes our understanding of modern conflict. It's 1916, Western Front. Tensions are, well, you can imagine.
Yeah, you could cut the tension with the bayonet, I bet.
Yeah, exactly. So the Allies are on the offensive here. What were they thinking heading into this?
Well, the Somme was supposed to be, the knockout punch,
Yeah.
the big push to break the stalemate and send the Germans packing. But to really get it, you got to understand trench warfare at this point in the war. This was no Napoleonic charge, sweeping across open fields. This was brutal, grinding, attritional warfare. Imagine miles of these muddy, rat-infested trenches, barbed wire everywhere, just, horrific tangles of it. Could trap a man like a fly in a spider web.
Sounds delightful.
Oh, yeah, real fun. And then you've got snipers, artillery fire raining down constantly. Every step you take, you're basically playing Russian roulette.
Yikes. So not exactly a walk in the park, but the Allies, they had some kind of plan, right? They weren't just sending men out to be slaughtered.
Well, they had a plan, all right,
Yeah.
a big one. The British, especially, were really banking on this massive artillery bombardment. We're talking over 1.75 million shells. Just an insane amount of firepower.
Wow, 1.75 million. That's almost unimaginable.
Yeah, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. But the idea was to just completely obliterate the German defenses, pulverize the trenches, clear out the barbed wire, and then the infantry, they just stroll in and mop up what was left.
Okay, given what you just said about, the whole trench warfare situation, that sounds, I know, a little optimistic, maybe even a little naive.
That's a good question. And historians are still debating that today. How much of it was naivete, how much was just, bad intelligence, whatever. But you got to remember, it was still relatively early in the war. Both sides were still figuring out this whole new way of fighting. And the British had put a ton of resources, time, money, everything into producing all those artillery shells. So there was this real belief that just sheer firepower could break the stalemate. They thought they could just blast their way to victory.
Well, we know how July 1st, 1916 turned out, the first day of the Somme Offensive, a date it's become synonymous with just unimaginable carnage, especially for the British.
Yeah, it's a dark day in history. Over 57,000 British casualties, over 19,000 killed. To give you some context, that's almost the same number of British casualties as in the entire Battle of France in World War II. But this was just one day. One day.
It's mind-boggling, the scale of it. And going through these accounts, it's clear this wasn't just about numbers. It was about entire communities being wiped out. The story of the Accrington Pals, for example, is just heartbreaking. These were men who enlisted together, friends, neighbors, practically every young man from this small town in Lancashire. They went over the top together, 720 of them, and 584 became casualties on that first day. Just devastating.
It really is. And the Accrington Pals, that's just one story. But there were so many others like it. It's hard to even fathom the collective grief, the sense of loss across entire nations.
So taking a step back and looking at how things unfolded, it seems pretty clear that the plan didn't exactly go as expected. Why was the Somme such a bloodbath? What were the key factors that made it so deadly?
Well, it was a perfect storm of just awful circumstances. A bunch of different things came together.
Yeah.
First, the bombardment. While it was huge, it wasn't nearly as effective as they thought it would be. The German trenches were a lot deeper than they realized, and they were really well fortified, reinforced with concrete, timber, the whole 9 yards. Those dugouts, they could withstand a lot more punishment than the Allies expected. And this is critical. A lot of the barbed wire, it was still intact. So
Yeah.
you've got these guys trying to advance across no man's land, tangled up in barbed wire, under heavy machine gun fire.
I'm starting to get a pretty grim picture here. So the German defenses, they were a lot tougher than the Allies thought.
Oh, yeah. They were ready for them. And we haven't even talked about the German tactics yet. They had these machine gun nests strategically placed all along their lines. And their soldiers, they were really well trained in defensive tactics. They had this concept called defense in depth, where their front lines were actually lightly manned, designed to absorb the initial attack. But then Further back, they had these main defensive positions, just bristling with firepower, ready to unleash hell on anyone who got that far.
So even if that bombardment had been more effective, the Allies were basically walking into a pre-prepared kill zone.
Exactly, it was a trap. And then you add in the tactical shortcomings on the Allied side. Their infantry tactics, they were basically outdated, still stuck in the 19th century,
Yeah.
wave after wave of soldiers advancing in these straight lines, shoulder to shoulder.
Like something out of a Civil War battlefield.
Yeah, pretty much. And that played right into the hands of those German machine gunners. It was a massacre.
It's almost like they were fighting the last war instead of adapting to the realities of this new kind of conflict. And of course, you can't talk about the Somme without mentioning the tanks. This was their first appearance on the battlefield, right? I can only imagine what it must have been like for those soldiers on both sides seeing these lumbering steel behemoths for the first time.
Oh, it must have been absolutely terrifying and awe-inspiring all at the same time. The tanks, they were a huge leap forward in military technology. But at this point, they were still very much in their early stages. They were
Yeah.
unreliable, prone to breaking down. Their engines would overheat, the tracks would come off in the mud, and the armor, while it was pretty good for the time, it wasn't invincible.
So not exactly the unstoppable force they were maybe hyped up to be?
No, not quite. Their impact at the Somme was limited, partly because of the reliability issues and also because they just didn't have that many of them.
Hmm.
But they did give a glimpse of the future of warfare, a future where these mechanized units, they'd become a major force on the battlefield.
It's amazing how even in the middle of all that chaos and carnage, you can see the seeds of what warfare would become.
Yeah, the Somme was this brutal testing ground.
Uh-huh.
Both sides were trying to figure out how to fight this new kind of war. And it forced them to innovate, to adapt or die.
Speaking of, the brutal realities of the Somme, the fighting didn't end on that first horrific day, did it?
No, not at all. It dragged on for months. It turned into this brutal war of attrition. Every yard gained, it cost thousands of lives. Both sides were just locked in this grinding struggle, each one determined to outlast the other. It was horrifying.
So the Somme, it became a test of endurance, a battle of wills as much as a clash of armies. What led to this shift from, the initial plan of a quick, decisive offensive to this drawn-out, bloody slog?
Well, it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that that initial plan, the whole we'll just blast our way to victory thing, it just wasn't going to work. They really underestimated how tough those German defenses were and just how brutal trench warfare really was.
So they were kind of forced to change things up on the fly, like right in the middle of this incredibly intense battle.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The Somme became this horrible laboratory, a testing ground for both sides. New technologies, new tactics. They were trying everything they could think of to break the stalemate. It was adapt or die, basically.
And what were some of those adaptations? Like, they couldn't just keep sending wave after wave of men into those machine guns. There had to be some changes in how they were approaching this.
Right. They had to come up with something different. And they did. The Somme forced them to move away from those old school linear assault tactics, just charging across no man's land in a big line. They started experimenting with new approaches, things like the creeping barrage. It was basically this wall of artillery fire moving slowly ahead of the infantry. The idea was to keep the enemy's heads down, suppress their defenses, and give the attackers some cover as they advanced.
So it's like a moving curtain of fire almost. But how did they even coordinate something like that with the technology they had back then? It seems like it would take a lot of precision, a lot of communication.
Yeah, it was a real challenge, for sure. It required a lot of coordination between the frontline troops and the artillery units. They started using runners, flares, even early forms of radio communication to try and get everyone on the same page.
Oh, I think.
And the Tram also saw the development of some specialized units like trench raiders. These guys were trained in infiltration tactics and, sneaking behind enemy lines, disrupting their defenses. It was a whole new way of fighting.
So the Somme wasn't just about, brute force, just throwing more men and artillery at the problem. It was also about innovation, about adapting to this new kind of warfare.
Exactly. And it's important to remember the Germans, they were adapting too. They were constantly refining their defensive tactics. Camouflage, machine guns, interlocking fields of fire. They were masters of defense, and they made those trenches into a real fortress.
It sounds like this terrifying chess match, with both sides trying to outmaneuver the other, but with thousands of lives hanging in the balance. And reading through these accounts, it's clear that the impact of the Somme, it went far beyond the battlefield itself. What about the psychological toll on the soldiers who went through this, the ones who were lucky enough to survive?
That's a really important point, and it's something we don't always talk about enough,
Mm.
the mental and emotional scars of war. The Somme, it was a soul-crushing experience for so many of those men. Just imagine living in those trenches for months on end, the constant shelling, the stench of death, the mud, the rats, knowing that at any moment you could be killed. It was traumatizing. And for a lot of those guys, the trauma, it stayed with them long after the war was over. It contributed to the whole, lost generation phenomenon.
We hear that phrase a lot, the lost generation, when we talk about World War One. But I'm curious, did it have a specific impact on the arts, on literature, on the way people express their experiences?
Oh, absolutely. The Somme had a huge influence on art and literature. You see it in the poetry of Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, the novels of Eric Maria Remarque, Hemingway, all these works that captured the brutality of trench warfare, the disillusionment, the sense of loss, the despair. It permeated an entire generation.
It's incredible how one battle can have such a ripple effect, not just on military tactics and technology, but on art, culture, on how we think about war itself.
Exactly. The Somme was a turning point. It really shattered any romantic notions people might have had about war. And it forced both sides to change, to come up with new ways of fighting if they wanted to survive.
Okay, so we've talked about the tactical shifts, the new technologies, the psychological toll, the impact on art and culture. But what about the bigger picture? How did the Somme affect the overall course of World War One? Did it actually bring the end of the war any closer?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's tough to say for sure, who really won the Somme. I mean, on paper, the Allies, they did push back the German lines. They achieved their objective in that sense. But at what cost? When you look at the sheer number of casualties, hundreds of thousands on both sides, it makes you question what victory even means in a situation like that.
Yeah, 7 miles and 141 days of fighting. That's just it's hard to even comprehend.
Yeah, it really puts things into perspective. Every inch of ground gained, it came at a horrific price. Strategically, though, you could argue that the Somme did have an impact on the wider war. It forced the
Yeah.
Germans to divert resources, pull troops and supplies away from other fronts like Verdun, which was another meat grinder of a battle. And some historians believe that the Somme, despite the losses, it did contribute to the eventual Allied victory
Hmm.
by weakening the Germans, wearing them down over time. But it's a complex question for sure.
It sounds like there's no easy answer. Can you really call it a win when both sides suffered so much?
Yeah, that's the debate, isn't it? Tactical victory, strategic blunder. Some historians look at the Somme and they see it as a prime example of the flawed thinking, the disregard for human life that really characterized so much of World War One. Others, they argue that it was a necessary step, a horrible one, but necessary on the road to Allied victory. It's a tough one.
I guess in the end, the Somme is less about who won in the traditional sense and more about the impact it had, right, on how wars were fought, on everything really.
Exactly. I mean, the Somme was a turning point. It shattered those romantic illusions about war that people might have still clung to, and it forced both sides to adapt, to develop new technologies, new tactics, tanks, aircraft, more sophisticated artillery, all those things. They played a major role in the later stages of the war and in all the conflicts that came after.
It was a catalyst for change in how wars were fought.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
it left a permanent mark on the memories of all the nations involved. It's something that we're still grappling with today.
Well, this has been an incredible journey from, the initial plans to the reality of the trenches, the new technologies, the legacy, the Somme. It's such a significant chapter in World War One history, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
And we wouldn't be here without your interests, your questions, this whole deep dive. It's about exploring these complexities, these horrors, and these human stories that make history so fascinating, so important to remember.
It's been fascinating and sobering at the same time. And before we wrap up, I want to leave you, our listener, with something to think about. Imagine yourself as a soldier at the Somme. On either side, it doesn't matter. You're there in the trenches, mud and blood everywhere, death all around you. How do you reconcile that objective of victory with the sheer human cost that you're seeing every single day? It's a question that everyone was wrestling with.
A question without an easy answer.
Exactly. But it's a question that we still need to ask ourselves, as we think about the legacies of past conflicts and how we build a more peaceful future. The Somme is a powerful reminder of the consequences of war, of the sacrifices that were made, and the need to strive for understanding, for reconciliation. So keep exploring, keep learning, read those personal accounts, the letters, the diaries. Let those stories of the Somme resonate with you, and let them guide you as you continue to delve into history. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.